For most of my life, I believed the worst thing my brother Thaddeus would ever do was become impossible to argue with when he thought he was right. My name is Delphine Ashworth, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. We had the kind of sibling relationship people envied from the outside and occasionally pitied from the inside. We fought like siblings do. We disagreed about everything from politics to where to get takeout to whether our mother was too lenient with us when we were teenagers. But underneath all that noise, I trusted him in the way you only trust someone who has seen you at your ugliest and still answers your calls. Thaddeus had that easy, bright confidence that made strangers like him and relatives believe him. I had always been the more careful one, the one who checked receipts, reread emails, and asked questions that made family dinners go quiet. Between us, that had somehow made him the person people assumed could handle the practical things while I was the one who handled the emotional ones. That arrangement mattered a lot after our mother died. 3 years before all of this came apart, our mother, Delphine Ashworth, passed away after a short and brutal illness that stripped her down fast. She had always been a practical woman. She believed in putting things in writing, labeling drawers, and never leaving important decisions to memory if paper could hold them instead. Even while she was sick, she managed to think clearly about what would happen after she was gone. She left Thaddeus and me a joint investment account funded mostly by the sale of the family house and a few other assets she had built up over the years. It was not some enormous fortune, but it was significant enough to matter. It was the kind of money that could change whether someone bought a home, opened a business, paid for a child's schooling, or simply slept better at night. Our mother had made the account with restrictions for a reason. Any withdrawal above a modest threshold required both of our signatures. She told us, more than once, that she did it that way because she wanted her legacy to remain a shared responsibility. She did not want one child making a private decision while the other was left to find out later. She said that money could make family members strange and suspicious, and she wanted the account to force us to keep talking to each other, to stay honest, to keep each other from doing anything rash. At the time, I thought that was just one more example of our mother being our mother. She had a way of turning life lessons into practical systems. Lock the cabinet, put the passwords in a notebook, label the holiday decorations by room so nobody argued later. I remember laughing when she explained the joint account setup, because even then she was already weak from treatment. Propped up in bed with one hand on my arm and the other pointing a spoon at Thaddeus, as if he were a boy again and not a man in his 40s. "You two," she had said, in that dry voice of hers, "cannot be trusted with anything expensive unless you are forced to agree." Thaddeus had laughed and promised her she was being dramatic. I had promised to keep an eye on him, and he had put a hand over his heart like a wounded actor and said that sounded suspiciously like discrimination. We all laughed then. I can still hear it if I think about her bedroom in that hospital bed, the curtains open, the afternoon light making her look thinner than she was. Back then, the account felt like a symbol of trust, not a trap. Thaddeus managed the day-to-day paperwork because he lived closer to the bank, and because, honestly, he liked being the person who handled things. He had always been better at presenting competence than I was. He ran a restaurant on the other side of the city, and even when he was exhausted, he looked like the kind of man who had everything under control. He could talk about inventory, labor cost, food waste, and supplier pricing with the same confidence he used when ordering wine for a table or telling a story at family gatherings. I was proud of him. We all were. Our mother had been proud of him too, maybe too proud if I'm honest. She spoke about his restaurant as if it were proof that he had found his place in the world, which mattered to him because as a child he had never liked the idea of being ordinary. He wanted to build something with his name on it. He wanted people to point at a dining room and say, "Thaddeus made this happen." I think our mother liked that ambition because she understood ambition as a form of survival. She grew up with very little and never forgot what it meant to scrape and save and build a life out of discipline. So when she died and left us the account, it seemed natural that Thaddeus would handle the banking side while I trusted him to keep me informed. He would send me occasional updates. I would sign whatever was needed when he asked. If there was an annual review, he handled the appointment. If there were statements, he emailed them over or mentioned them over the phone. Nothing ever seemed off. I had my own job, my own apartment, my own life. I did not spend much time imagining that a sibling could turn a shared inheritance into a private lifeline. Then the bank called. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of ordinary day that makes a shock even worse, because nothing in the weather or the light or the sound of traffic outside your window is preparing you for it. I was in my kitchen, halfway through making coffee, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voicemail preview said it was from a bank compliance department, so I answered. The woman on the line introduced herself professionally and asked if I was Delphine Ashworth. I said yes. She explained that their routine review process had flagged several large withdrawals from the joint investment account I held with my brother. The wording was careful, almost too careful, and that should have warned me right away. She said the transactions had been spread out over the past 18 months and that the signatures on the authorization forms appeared to be mine. I remember gripping the edge of the counter because I thought I had misheard her. She repeated the numbers. Several withdrawals. $140-something thousand in total. My own signature on the forms. A routine review. A discrepancy they were obligated to check. I said, very slowly, that I had never signed any withdrawal request like that. I told her I didn't even remember being asked. I asked her to repeat the date of the first one, and then the second, and then the largest. She gave them to me one by one while I wrote them down with a hand that suddenly felt disconnected from the rest of my body. The oldest one was more than a year old. The newest was only a few weeks old. For a moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt cold. It was a physical sensation, like someone had opened a window in winter right inside my chest. I kept looking around my kitchen as if an explanation might be written on the refrigerator door or tucked into the fruit bowl. The bank woman was still talking, telling me they would need written confirmation from me, that they could send copies of the flagged requests, that they were not accusing anyone yet, but that they needed to verify whether the signatures were legitimate. I asked her if this could be some kind of clerical misunderstanding. Maybe my brother had authority I had forgotten about. Maybe I had signed a general form months ago and not remembered. I knew, even as I asked, that I was searching for a bridge back to normal. She answered carefully that their concern existed precisely because the pattern did not look like a simple administrative error. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my coffee mug until it went cold. My first instinct was to call Thaddeus. My second instinct was to scream at him. My third, which surprised me, because I am usually not that strategic under stress, was to do neither of those things. I called the bank back and asked for copies of every flagged withdrawal request, every signature, every record they had. I told them I wanted to review the documentation before I said anything to my brother. The compliance officer agreed without hesitation. She sounded sympathetic, but not surprised. That bothered me almost as much as the call itself. I spent the rest of that afternoon in a fog. I did not go back to work after lunch. I told my manager I had a family emergency, which felt almost funny because that was exactly what this was and exactly what I no longer knew. Was it a family emergency? A theft? A misunderstanding? A betrayal? There are certain moments when language becomes too slow to keep up with reality. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying every conversation I had had with Thaddeus over the past year. Every time he said the restaurant was busy. Every time he brushed off a question about his finances. Every time he mentioned a supplier problem or an equipment repair or a staffing shortage. I had never thought to ask more than I did, because siblings have a way of trusting the version of each other they already know. Thaddeus had always been proud. He hated admitting failure. If he said things were under control, I believed him because I wanted to. The documents arrived within days. I opened them at my dining room table and spread them out like evidence in a case I was not ready to believe was mine. Each form had my name on it. Each form had what was supposed to be my signature. At first glance, it looked close enough. That was the worst part. It was not some clumsy fake you could dismiss with a glance. It was careful. Whoever had signed my name had understood the shape of it. The loops were almost right. The letters leaned in the general direction they should. To anyone who did not know my signature well, it might have passed. But I knew it. I knew the small differences the way you know your own face in a mirror. The angle was wrong. The pressure was wrong. The rhythm was wrong. My real signature was hurried and inconsistent, because I always signed things while moving, while talking, while half thinking about somewhere else I needed to be. These versions were too even, too controlled, too consistent from one form to another. They had the dead perfection of something copied by hand over and over until the person making it believed they had mastered it. I took out old documents, bills, a lease renewal, a doctor's form, even a card I had signed for our mother years ago, and compared them line by line. My stomach turned every time I looked back at the bank paperwork. There was no doubt left in me by the end of the hour. Someone had forged my signature. I called an attorney the next morning. Priscilla Nakamura came recommended by a friend of a friend, the kind of lawyer people name when they know they cannot afford a mistake. She specialized in financial fraud, inheritance disputes, and family cases that had turned poisonous. When I met her, she listened without interrupting while I explained the account, the bank's call, the forms, and my suspicion that Thaddeus had been forging my name. She had a calm, direct manner that made me feel both more frightened and slightly less alone. She did not tell me I was overreacting. She did not tell me to wait and ask my brother nicely. She asked for copies of everything, then asked me a series of very specific questions. How often did Thaddeus handle the bank account? Did I have independent access to statements? Did I ever receive notices directly from the bank? Had I ever seen the original withdrawal forms before? Had there ever been a time I gave him blanket permission to act in my name? The answer to that last question was no, and I could hear how important that sounded even before she explained it. Priscilla said we needed 2 professionals right away: a forensic document examiner to verify the signatures and a forensic accountant to trace where the money had gone. If this was what it looked like, she said, then the financial trail would matter as much as the signatures. One proved the theft. The other showed the motive and the scale. I wanted to ask whether I was being dramatic. There is something about accusing family that makes you want to apologize, even while you're standing in the middle of a crime scene. Instead, I asked her how long it would take. As long as it takes to be certain, she said. The document examiner came first. Her name was Margaret Lynn, and she was the kind of woman who could look at a signature and tell you more about a person's habits than most people learn in 10 years of marriage. She examined the handwriting under magnification, measured the pressure points, analyzed the spacing, and compared the forms against authenticated samples of my actual signature. I watched her work in silence, trying not to twist my own hands into knots. When she finally spoke, she did not sound surprised either. The signatures on the withdrawals were simulated with a high degree of care, she said. Close enough to mislead casual review, not close enough to withstand forensic comparison. There were consistent deviations in timing, curvature, and pen lift. In plain language, the signature had been copied by someone who had access to my name, my basic style, and enough time to practice it. I asked her if it was possible to fake a signature that well without intent. No, she said. That one word settled something in me. Not comfort, not peace, just certainty. Cornelius Akabe, the forensic accountant, was more talkative, though not in a careless way. He had the patient energy of a man who could turn a pile of bank statements into a clear story if you gave him enough coffee and enough time. He spread documents across a conference table in Priscilla's office and explained that he would track every withdrawal from the joint account to the destination accounts, then map how the money was used. He would look for timing, patterns, regular transfers, cash flow gaps, and any evidence that the joint inheritance was covering an operation that could not survive on its own. That phrase stuck in my head, could not survive on its own. I knew, intellectually, that restaurants are difficult businesses. Everyone knows that. Margins are thin, overhead is brutal, and one bad season can put a place in the ground. But Thaddeus had always talked about his restaurant as if it were a triumph of grit and taste and excellent management. He used words like expansion and growth and opportunities. He talked about staff loyalty and returning customers and the new menu. He invited us there for birthdays and holidays and said the dining room was busier than ever. I had believed him because I wanted him to be telling the truth. While Cornelius worked, I moved through my life in a strange double exposure. I went to work, I answered emails, I made dinner. I called my friend Lena and tried to explain why I sounded weird without explaining enough to trigger a full panic response. I slept badly, woke early, and checked my phone too often. Every time Thaddeus texted, my body reacted before my mind could. Usually it was something mundane. Did I still want to come to Cousin Ava's birthday dinner? Was I bringing dessert to the holiday gathering? Had I heard from Mom's old neighbor about the charity fundraiser? He sounded normal, funny even, as if nothing in his life had changed. That normality made me feel sick. Once he called while I was sitting at my desk at work. I stepped into the hallway to answer because I couldn't bear to let anyone hear the tone I used with him. He said he was trying a new seafood special and asked if I would come by the restaurant sometime that week. We've been doing better than expected this quarter, he said, in a voice casual enough to sound proud, but not so proud that it would seem rehearsed. Better than expected. I remember pressing my fingers into my forehead and staring out the office window at a parking lot while he chatted about renovations and supplier negotiations. He had no idea that Cornelius was in the middle of proving our mother's inheritance was the thing keeping his better-than-expected quarter afloat. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the scale of the lie was so absurd it momentarily outran my anger. Priscilla had advised me not to confront him immediately, and at first I hated that advice. Everything in me wanted to call him and demand the truth. But she explained the risk with the kind of clarity that is impossible to argue against. If I confronted him too soon, he could panic, destroy records, make partial restitution, or claim I had agreed verbally and then changed my mind. He could rewrite the story as a family loan or an informal arrangement. If we waited until we had the full picture, including the exact path of the money and the duration of the forgery, he would have far fewer places to hide. So I waited. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Waiting does something ugly to your imagination. It gives betrayal time to grow roots. I began to picture Thaddeus sitting in the restaurant office after closing, signing my name with the same pen over and over while the kitchen was still warm behind him. I imagined him folding the statements, filing the forms, telling himself he would fix it before I ever found out. I imagined the first time he did it, and the second and the third, each time convincing himself that he was only borrowing against a future that would arrive later if he just worked hard enough. Then I imagined the point where the lie stopped being temporary. Cornelius's findings came back in waves, each one worse than the last. The withdrawals were carefully spaced, not so regular that they looked automated, not so clustered that they raised a panic. The amounts varied just enough to avoid easy detection thresholds. In some months, the money covered payroll. In others, vendor invoices. One large withdrawal matched a lease renewal that had been due when the restaurant clearly did not have the funds to keep its space. Another one lined up with an equipment replacement after the walk-in cooler failed. A third was used to patch a cash flow gap during a slow winter stretch. Thaddeus had not just been stealing from the inheritance. He had been using it like an oxygen tank. That detail changed the shape of the betrayal. If he had taken one large amount and confessed later, I might have been furious, but at least I would have understood the crisis. What Cornelius showed instead was a pattern of management, one that required planning, timing, and sustained deceit. Thaddeus had built an entire invisible bridge between the joint account and his business and then walked across it month after month while pretending nothing was happening. The restaurant had been quietly failing for nearly 2 years. The words landed hard because they meant that every casual update he had given me during that time had been false or at best misleading. His customers never saw the strain. Our family never saw the strain. He had preserved the illusion with the same skill he used to keep his staff calm when the kitchen was slammed. He had told us the place was doing well. He had smiled through gatherings. He had accepted compliments. He had let our mother's memory become the source of his rescue without telling the sister who co-owned the rescue. I remember the night Cornelius first laid out the full chain of transfers. I sat in his office with Priscilla and stared at the chart as if it might rearrange itself into something less damning. He showed me one transfer after another, each withdrawal feeding directly into restaurant accounts, each one covering a hole that should have forced a shutdown or an admission months earlier. He pointed to the dates, the amounts, the routing, the telltale pattern of desperation disguised as management. "This is not a one-time misuse," he said. "This is a sustained diversion of funds, sustained diversion." It sounds clinical when an accountant says it. It feels like a knife when you know the person who did it. I asked him how long it might have gone unnoticed if the bank hadn't flagged it. "Potentially longer," he said, depending on how long he could keep up the pattern and whether other controls were in place. But the account structure did what it was designed to do. It eventually triggered review because the balance and withdrawal history no longer fit the profile expected for a joint legacy account. I thought about my mother then. She had not been naive. She had built that account because she knew people change under stress. She knew money can turn a family member into someone you no longer recognize. I wished, with a kind of helpless fury, that she had lived long enough to see what her safeguard had caught. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from discovering a dead parent was wiser than you were and still could not protect you from the people left behind. During those 4 weeks, Thaddeus kept calling me about normal things. He asked me if I wanted the cinnamon cake at our aunt's gathering. He reminded me that our cousin's birthday was coming up. He complained about a dishwasher issue at the restaurant. Once he sent me a picture of a new dessert special and asked for my opinion. I looked at the photo and thought about payroll shortfalls hidden inside the same business he was trying to make look charming on the surface. At one point, he asked if I wanted to stop by for dinner that weekend. I almost said yes, then imagined sitting across from him while he smiled and lied. I made up an excuse about being tired from work. "Everything okay?" he asked. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Just busy." Busy, that word felt pathetic in the face of what was happening, but it was all I could manage without either exploding or confessing too much. Priscilla and I discussed every possible version of the confrontation. She wanted me prepared for tears, denial, anger, and shame. She said family fraud rarely looks theatrical at first. Usually the guilty person starts by minimizing. They claim necessity. They claim temporary borrowing. They claim the victim misunderstood the permission structure. Then they try to shift blame onto the The bank, the stress, the market, the spouse, the weather, anything except the choice they made. She was right. The evening we confronted Thaddeus, the restaurant had already closed. The front dining room was dark except for the amber lights above the bar, and the kitchen smelled faintly of garlic, detergent, and stale heat. Thaddeus had not expected us. I could tell by the way he looked up from the counter, still holding a towel over one shoulder, his smile already forming before he recognized my face was not there to have dinner. Then he saw Priscilla and Cornelius behind me. His expression changed in a way I will never forget. Not guilt exactly. More like a man realizing the ground beneath his carefully built house has started to sink. "What's going on?" he asked. We sat him at one of the empty tables near the front, the same table where he usually seated older couples and small family groups. Priscilla laid out the documents: the forensic report, the bank records, the accounting reconstruction. Cornelius spread the timeline of withdrawals across the tabletop in neat rows. I watched my brother's face as each page was revealed. He read the numbers at first without speaking, then with visible shrinking, as if the evidence itself were physically reducing him. He tried denial for maybe 10 seconds. "These aren't what they look like," he said, and even then he did not sound convinced. Priscilla asked him to identify the signature forms. He could not. She asked whether he had handled the account paperwork. He admitted he had. She asked whether I had signed each of those forms. He looked at me instead of her, and in that instant I understood that he had known for a while this was no longer a matter of if but when. I asked him if he had forged my signature. He closed his eyes. That was answer enough, but he still spoke. "Yes," he said quietly. The room became very still. Even the kitchen noise in the back seemed to fade, or maybe I was no longer hearing it properly. He told us the restaurant had been struggling longer than anyone knew. At first it had been manageable. Then a bad quarter turned into another bad quarter. Foot traffic dropped. Suppliers raised prices. One of his best servers left. A kitchen repair cost more than expected. He had tried to keep up appearances because he was embarrassed, and because once he had told the staff things were stable, he felt trapped in that story. I asked him why he never came to me. "I didn't want to fail in front of you," he said. I almost said, "So you stole from me instead?" But I held it back because if I had said it then, I don't know whether I would have been able to stop. He talked faster after that, as if confession had loosened something he had been squeezing shut for months. He said he thought it would be temporary. He said he fully intended to repay the account once business picked back up. He said he had believed a better season was right around the corner. He said he had told himself the inheritance was still our family money, so he was not really taking from a stranger. He said the first forged signature had felt monstrous, but the second and third had felt easier because by then he had already crossed the line. I remember asking him how many times. His jaw tightened. "Enough," he said. That answer told me everything I needed to know. Enough to make a pattern, enough to hollow out our mother's legacy, enough to put his business ahead of my consent for 18 months. Priscilla did not let the conversation drift into emotional fog. She explained the legal reality in plain terms. The forgery mattered. The unauthorized withdrawals mattered. The bank's review mattered. The forensic findings mattered. If I wanted restitution, we needed a formal acknowledgement and documentation of the wrongdoing. She also made it clear that although I was not eager to involve the police, we could not treat this as a private misunderstanding and then hope it disappeared. Thaddeus's face collapsed when she said that. He looked older suddenly, the kind of older that comes from shame rather than age. He kept insisting he had never meant to hurt me. He said he had been trying to save the business because his employees depended on it, because people had jobs, because a shutdown would have hurt others, not just him. He said he thought he could catch up before I noticed. He said he had not meant to steal, only to borrow. Borrowing is a funny word when the lender has never agreed. I asked him if he had ever planned to tell me. He hesitated just long enough. That was the moment I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. He had planned to keep me in the dark as long as possible. Maybe he had imagined a future confession. Maybe he had imagined replacing the money in a grand dramatic gesture. But he had chosen secrecy over honesty every single time it mattered. I told him he had not just damaged the account. He had damaged the trust our mother had deliberately built into it. He cried then. Real crying, not performative. He covered his face with both hands and said he did not know what else to do. I believed that he felt trapped. I did not believe that helplessness excused what he had done. There is a gulf between understanding why someone panicked and forgiving the choices they made while panicking. Priscilla led the discussion back to practical steps. Thaddeus would need to cooperate with restitution. He would need to provide full access to the restaurant's finances. He would need to stop using the account immediately. He would need to sign an acknowledgement of the unauthorized transfers and agree to a repayment structure. Depending on the evidence and my decision, there could be criminal exposure, but for the moment my priority was to secure the funds and protect the remaining account balance. I was not in the mood to be noble, I was in the mood to be correct, so I told him he would repay every dollar that could be traced, and that if he wanted any chance of keeping this from becoming a police matter, he needed to be honest with Priscilla and cooperative with Cornelius. I did not promise forgiveness. I did not promise a clean family reconciliation. I promised only that I would not lie to the bank, and I would not let him pretend this had been harmless. He nodded like a man underwater. The next phase was quieter, but no less painful. Priscilla filed the necessary documentation to protect my legal position and to formalize the account review. The bank froze the suspicious access points and increased oversight on the joint account. Cornelius finished the forensic accounting and prepared a complete summary of the diverted funds. Thaddeus, to his credit, or perhaps to his shame, did not resist once the evidence was undeniable. He provided records for the restaurant and admitted the full extent of the cash flow problems. The business was not just struggling, it was sliding toward collapse. He had delayed vendor payments, he had juggled payroll, he had covered lease obligations with inherited money while telling everyone the restaurant was simply growing. He had been using the appearance of success to buy time. That kind of lying is almost always selfish, even when it is wrapped in panic. It protects the liar from embarrassment first, and everyone else only incidentally. We learned that the place had been surviving on borrowed time for months longer than any of us had guessed. There were creditors, there were overdue invoices, there were staff members who had no idea how close they were to losing their jobs. There were nights when he had told the kitchen to cut a special because he was trying to hide how thin the margins had become. There were maintenance repairs he had patched over instead of replacing properly because every dollar was already spoken for. As the picture became clearer, I found myself going through stages I didn't fully recognize at the time. Rage, yes, but also humiliation. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had trusted the wrong version of him for too long. Every family system has its own invisible rules, and one of ours had always been that Thaddeus was the charismatic one and I was the cautious one. He could get away with optimism because I assumed caution would compensate for it. I had mistaken my own vigilance for protection. One night after a long call with Priscilla, I went through our mother's old files. I found the letter she had left with the account paperwork. It was not dramatic, just practical, written in her careful hand. She said she had set up the joint structure because she wanted us to use the money responsibly and together. She warned us that grief can make people greedy, afraid, or foolish. She wrote that the account was meant to remind us that inheritance was not a prize but a responsibility. I sat at the kitchen table reading that letter again and again until the words blurred. Our mother had seen the possibility of this, maybe not in detail, but in spirit. She had built a guardrail around us because she knew love does not eliminate risk. I felt angry that her caution had been necessary. I felt angry that it had not been enough. And underneath both feelings was a grief that was older than the fraud itself. The grief of realizing that the family you thought could be trusted had already begun changing before you noticed. The repayment plan took shape over several conversations. Thaddeus's only realistic path was to sell the restaurant assets and use the proceeds toward restitution. Priscilla made it clear that any agreement would need to be enforceable and documented. He could not simply promise to pay later from future income, not when the future of the business was already so unstable. He agreed, though agreed is probably too clean a word for the defeated way he sat across from us while the details were hammered out. He spoke occasionally about how much the place had meant to him. He talked about the regulars, the staff, the recipe development, the identity he had built there. I understood all of that. I even felt sympathy for it. But sympathy and exoneration are not the same thing. Lots of people lose businesses without forging their sister's signature. He had choices. He made one. In the weeks that followed, I had to answer questions from the bank, review statements, and confirm my identity more times than I care to remember. Every signature I made now felt heavier. I checked everything twice. I kept copies of everything. I learned how quickly trust can become procedure. Some family members found out something had happened before we told them all the details. Our aunt called to ask why Thaddeus looked like he had not slept. A cousin mentioned that the restaurant seemed off lately. I gave careful answers, because family systems are full of people who want the truth, but not the consequences of hearing it. When we finally did explain that there had been financial wrongdoing, the reactions were exactly as mixed as you would expect. Some relatives were furious on my behalf. Some wanted to soften it with concern for Thaddeus. One uncle said men sometimes panic when their businesses fail, as if panic were a free pass. Another relative asked whether the bank had made an error, as if the idea of a forged signature were too ugly to fit inside the family photo. That was one of the hardest parts. Not the fraud itself, but the way people tried to tidy it up afterward. Everyone likes a story in which everybody means well. Nobody likes a story where someone they know lies over and over because pride matters more than honesty. A few days after the confrontation, Thaddeus sent me a message asking if we could talk privately without lawyers. I stared at it for a long time before answering. Priscilla had already told me not to do anything off the record. If I wanted privacy, it needed to be within boundaries. I agreed to speak with him only in her office, with her present. He looked exhausted when he arrived. Not just tired, empty around the eyes. He sat down and said he had been replaying everything in his head. He said he understood why I would never trust him the same way again. He said he had convinced himself the theft was temporary because the alternative was facing failure. He admitted that every month he had intended to stop after the next payment, after the next good weekend, after the next new menu launch, after the next seasonal change. There was always another reason to postpone the truth. I asked him whether he had realized what he was doing to me when he forged my name. He looked directly at the table. "Not enough," he said. That was the closest thing to honesty I got without fighting for it. I told him that was exactly the problem. He had treated my consent as optional because admitting failure felt harder than violating my trust. He had taken advantage of the fact that I was not watching the account closely enough. He had hidden behind the family structure our mother designed to protect us, and he had exploited the very assumption of honesty it was built on. He did not argue. He asked if I hated him. I thought about that question for a long time before answering, because the truthful answer was messier than yes or no. I did not hate him in the abstract. I hated what he had done. I hated that he had made me fear my own memory for a moment. I hated that I had spent nights wondering whether I was missing something obvious. I hated that he had forced me into the role of investigator in my own family. But underneath that anger was still a thread of sibling knowledge, the old awareness that he was a deeply flawed man who had built too much of his self-worth on looking successful. "I don't know what I feel yet," I said. That was true too. The final agreement required Thaddeus to liquidate what he could from the restaurant, document the repayment schedule, and cooperate fully with the bank and our attorneys. The sale process was humiliating for him, and I am not proud of the fact that part of me felt vindicated watching the glamorous image of his business collapse under actual numbers. But another part of me, the part that remembers him at 22 carrying boxes for the first apartment we rented together, felt the sadness of seeing someone destroy the thing they had built by lying about it. He started making apologies in that period, some of them better than others.